Welcome to the TMRN Time Monk Radio Network. I'm Jules, and today is Friday, the 12th of August 2011. Returning to the show is Clif from halfpasthuman.com. Hi Clif, thanks for coming back to the show during this extremely eventful week.
Thank you for having me. It's been a very interesting times indeed, yes.
For sure. The WebBot Forum administrator is Fox, and today he will be doing the recording and technical support of the show. Several members of the forum were kind enough to join us tonight. They include members Chipperdog, Green Meadow, Diane VG, Lenny, Paul Muir, and Turd Ferguson. For listeners, this interview will assume you have a good understanding of Clif's work, familiarity with his shape reports, and have listened to his past interviews, in particular to his last interviews with Veritas, TMRN, and Suzanne Toro. Again, Clif's website is halfpasthuman.com. The interview again will be available on YouTube for free on the WebBot Forum channel and at the website webbotforum.com. Today's interview will start with a discussion on current events. Following that, we'll discuss member questions, and at the end, we'll discuss the future and boats. Yes, boats. And why boats may be such a valuable tool in the future, along with 3 pairs of good shoes and a good cave. Clif, let's start economics. In the message you passed onto the forum last Friday, you stated that questions posed to you may be moot by the time we reach the 12th. With the S&P downgrading US sovereign debt, the 500-point moves in the Dow, the spike in gold to just short of $1,800 an ounce, and the continual collapse of Europe spreading to Italy, Spain, and now French banks. Is this what you were expecting, and do you still expect $5 and $20 a day moves in silver?
Yes to both. The first, though, I actually expected we'd be further along. We have a 3-day variance in our time projection on the immediacy data, so I actually had thought that the events we'll see by the 15th and 16th would have manifested by now, and so we would be further into the process and have a little bit more to chew on here. But yes to both. I still expect the $5 and then a $20 days and then a series of collapses. And we're seeing a couple of the temporal markers along the way that we'd talked about, including the blue bankruptcy. It is the post office.
Wow. Before we hand over to Joe, I just wanted a quick one. What do you expect on the 15th and the 16th?
No, not anything in particular. I have a few things that we think will pop over these next few days, especially related to the Obama administration. But that gets a little tricky. You don't want to be really accurate in forecasting that sort of stuff, or you might get a visit from some Treasury agents, which I'd rather avoid, to be honest. So I won't say anything specific about that, but over these next few days there will be some visible progression in both the political chaos and the economic chaos, such that on the 15th and 16th we'll say, aha, we've added another 20% to the total chaos pyramid that we're building here, if we sort of think of it as building the pyramid from the bottom up.
Wow, interesting. Turd, did you have some questions for Clif?
Oh, yes, I sure do. Clif, let me tell you, it is a terrific pleasure to get a chance to visit with you.
Oh, this is great. Yeah, I follow your stuff. I love people with interesting names, so hey.
I was telling everyone earlier, if I had given it more thought, I would have come up with something more glamorous than Turd.
No. There's a whole lot of good karma associated with that, and going back centuries and centuries and centuries.
Well,
sometime offline, I'll go into that with you.
I like the sound. That'll make my mother feel better. I know that. Well, and I, anticipating this opportunity to speak with you, I solicited some of the members of my website to see if there were some things that they wanted me to discuss with you. And I guess I would start with the potential for war and what you see there, and that it is, I don't want to call it an organizing principle of society, but it seems like when...
No, we should call it exactly that. We should acknowledge that it's been labeled appropriately by such eminent worthies as Catherine Austin Fitts when she notes the central bank warfare model, because it truly is that. They must indeed have a war in order for things to accelerate in their particular agenda.
Exactly, to perpetuate their agenda, it seems.
Correct.
Too. And as we approach this end game or this end game, if you will, it seems that war would be one of the cards in their hand that they would play. And so along those lines, and this will dovetail into maybe a discussion about the dollar. What are you seeing? Are you anticipating anything flaring up in the Middle East?
Yes, we do actually have some linguistic support because we have kept the spiders running continuously on a couple of key phrases, especially the Israeli mistake. I'm always sweeping for that, and we actually have evidence building that they're ramping up the Israel versus Iran thing again. However, the data interpretation would argue that they have perhaps waited a bit too long. There was always this thing back maybe in the late 90s, early zeros there, where there was a discussion about Israel as a tool when we actually thought it was a tool of American foreign policy instead of the other way around. And there was a discussion that Israel would never be unleashed on the enemy, meaning Iran, until the economic collapse had been well seated. The theory being that would initiate a certain kind of economic collapse, so you could only let them go after things had reached basically where we're at now.
Right.
And so they're actually sort of ramping up that language, and it's elevated by about 6 to 7% in the last week and a half or so in the spiders that we run that check the continuing current language against forecast language. Now, this one is a little tricky because the Israeli mistake has been wafting and waning and waxing and waning like the moon, and up and down for years now, and it's never really gone away, although it had settled to a low back burner. And it's just a little bit disturbing that it's starting to come out now. However, in counterpunch, I have to say that the scathing editorials about the sellout 20% of Congress going over to be indoctrinated by the evil Zionist, that kind of language is escalating to the point where we may get some level of balance or something out of it. It may not pan out the way the agenda people would push.
Interesting. Well, and as that, I guess, kind of dovetails into some of the other issues that folks want to discuss, and that is the ultimate fall of the dollar, not only in its value but in its end as the global reserve currency. I can see where the Saudis and all the other oil exporting countries are not only frustrated by the declining value of their dollar reserves, but since their primary product is priced in dollars. Some have suggested to me that the first brushstroke of the end of the dollar will be the OPEC saying they no longer want to use the dollar as a exchange device. But does your work ever hear of that type of discussion? Do you ever see that type of thing out there?
Sure. Oh, yeah. It's been a topic of discussion for a couple of years now on some of the German economic forums. Mm-hmm. And curiously, the Polish as well. They have a keen interest in currency movements. But our data suggested that I don't know. The first signs have already happened. So if we get into some more current events over this next week and say the United States Postal Service collapses as a going entity, then we must acknowledge that at that point, I think that's a far bigger sign of dollar death than the oil or petrodollar link, primarily because the post office is the second largest mover of money in the wire transfer world. And if they're going down, maybe they'll keep that as their core business, but this is a huge impact on our social order.
Right. Well, then as that dovetails then into the dollar and then the euro, there's so much discussion about the future of the euro at this point and whether that was a failed experiment to begin with and it's now just finally coming apart. What do you see there, Clif? Do you see the euro being able to continue in its current format? I've had discussions with folks that kind of postulate that they will kick out some of the southern countries and instead have kind of a Nordic euro, and that those are discussions are already taking place, and that in the end you'll have maybe 3 regional reserve currencies rather than one global reserve currency. Do you get that feeling at all?
Sure. Yeah. Actually, I was part of the very, very, very early days of the EU experiment when it was still called the European Community, the European Trade Union, and all the other names under which they foisted it upon Europe. And there's some things that people need to understand, that if you look at it from a very broad perspective and step way back and look at the human species and at that time, you can say that here is a very curious thing indeed. Because from the period of time that they started introducing the concept of the European community, not Europe, not old Europe, but this new European community. We're talking late 50s. They really rolled it out. They'd been discussing it in the 47, 48 period, but in the late 50s they rolled it out. In the early 60s they started pushing it very hard with the young generations in Europe in the rebuilding of the aftermath of World War II. Now, curiously, even then, the younger generations were exhibiting the larger archetypical trend that we are all part of, which is what we call a self-organizing collectives, or a movement towards a more local community. So here we have the idea of imposing a mega supranational state on a loose collection of countries only bound by continental association and even separated by diversity of language and interests. Yeah. And yet they were going to make it into a national mega state starting in the 60s, and they kept pushing in spite of everybody's protest to the contrary. They kept shoving it down everybody's throats until we find ourselves with the European Trade Union, and then the European Collective Congress, and then the whole thing about Brussels, and then it just grows and grows and grows, and finally, aha, here we are, let's shove a euro currency down everybody's throat. We note that was counter to the trend, and I personally see no intrinsic support for the euro and never have. It was not an experiment. It was a means of oppression, and I never saw it as anything other than that. Having lived through several currency crises, including the switch from the old franc to the new franc in the early 60s, and seeing the death and struggles there, I realized just how powerful currencies were at a very young age. And I knew something was fishy when everybody around me, all the adults, were just grumbling, and the old guys were always muttering under their breath and, talking into the foam of their beer about this nasty European community. And it will fail, and it's failing now. Whether we end up with a Scandinavian Union or some subset of Germanic peoples or something along those lines, it's going to be pretty much anybody's guess, but they've been talking about the Scandinavian Union for a number of years. I think that the pressures are still more for a period of, if you will, relaxation from Uber control that had been imposed by the European authority.
Yeah. Do you have, does your work suggest a timeline that you're comfortable with discussing, not only the euro but the dollar?
Sure, yeah. We can get into details, but we need to separate it into two conceptual frameworks, okay? And the one framework is absent the current level of immediate